The morning Louise Doyle arrived in Caldwell, Kansas, with nothing but a carpetbag, a dead man's name, and a pair of eyes that had already seen too much grief for a woman of 26 years. The dust storm rolling in from the south seemed almost to have been waiting for her. She stepped off the westbound stage with her chin lifted, and her jaw set in the particular way of a woman who has decided that the world owes her nothing, and that she intends to collect anyway. Her dress was mended at the hem twice, and the color had been washed so many times it had surrendered whatever opinion it once held about being blue. She carried the carpetbag in one hand and a small paper envelope in the other, and that envelope she held with considerably more care than she gave to anything else she owned. Inside it were seeds, tomato seeds, to be exact. 23 of them, which she had counted that morning in the coach while the man across from her snored and the woman beside her complained about the heat. They had come from her mother's garden in Missouri. Pressed into her palm the afternoon, she buried her husband Daniel Doyle in the churchyard of a town called Harlan Crossing, and decided she could not spend one more winter looking at his empty chair. Daniel had been a good man, steady, quiet, careful with money and feelings in equal measure. He had died in February of 1878 from a fever that came on fast and left even faster, taking him with it before the doctor could do much more than shake his head. They had been married 4 years and had no children, which was a sorrow Louise carried separately from the sorrow of losing him, like 2 different weights in 2 different pockets. She had loved Daniel in the sure, dependable way you love something that has always been there, and losing him had left a hole that was less like a wound and more like a room in a house where the furniture had been removed, and you kept walking and expecting to find it. She had heard about the land opportunities in southern Kansas from a man at church who had a cousin near Caldwell who swore the soil was rich and the future was wide open. Louise was not naive enough to believe everything a church man said about his cousin's prospects, but she was desperate enough to listen, and sometimes desperation and wisdom arrive at the same destination by different roads. What she had was $43, the seeds, 1 change of clothes, a cast iron skillet that she was not willing to part with under any circumstances, and the kind of stubbornness that tends to either ruin a person or save them, with very little middle ground. The town of Caldwell in the spring of 1878 was a cattle town on the edge of transforming into something else, though no one quite knew what that something else was going to be. The Kishom Trail still pushed longhorns through in the summer months, and the saloons on the main street did their best business when the drovers came north with dust in their beards and silver in their pockets. There was a general store, a bank, a feed and grain, a doctor's office, a church with a bell that worked on Sundays and saints' days, and a land office that opened at 8 in the morning and closed whenever the man inside felt like going to lunch. Louise walked into the land office at 8:30. A thin man with spectacles and ink on 3 of his fingers looked up from behind a desk stacked with papers. "I want to file a homestead claim," she said, "under the Homestead Act." He looked at her in the way men in offices often looked at women who came in alone and made requests, a look that was not quite dismissive but was not quite respectful either, occupying a gray territory of waiting to see if she was serious. "You a widow?" he asked. "I am." "You got the $5 filing fee?" "I do." He nodded slowly. "The act allows for a widow to file in her own name. You'll need to work 160 acres for 5 years to prove the claim. Most of the free land left near here is about 8 miles northeast of town. It's good land, but it's dry land and it needs working." "I know how to work," Louise said. She paid the $5, which left her with 38, and walked out of the land office with a paper that said she had the right to 160 acres of Kansas earth, which she did not yet know how to farm on the scale required, and with no shelter, no tools, no well, and no neighbors within comfortable distance. She stood in the street outside and looked north, then east, and then she noticed the ranch. It was not the kind of thing you could miss on the road out of Caldwell. The Kendrick Ranch sat on a broad rise about 2 miles from the main road, and even from a distance you could see it had been built by someone who intended to stay. The fence posts were straight. The barn was red-painted and solid. There was a main house that was larger than most out here, with a porch that ran the full width of the front, and a bunkhouse off to the east side, and corrals where horses moved in the morning light. The man who owned it was named Matthew Kendrick, and he was 34 years old and had been running cattle in southern Kansas since he was 22. He had come out from Tennessee with his father, who died in 1871 of a bad heart, and had built the ranch from the 40 acres his father had left him into the 400 it was now. He was known in Caldwell as a fair man, hard but not cruel, who paid his hands on time and his debts before they were due. He kept mostly to himself outside of business, though he was not unfriendly. He had never married, and the town had stopped speculating about it, the way towns eventually stop speculating about most things once enough time passes. He was in the corral working a bay gelding when the wagon brought Louise Doyle out from town. She had hired old Amos Chester, who ran a freight service from the livery, to carry her and her carpetbag and her cast iron skillet out to her claim, and the road that led northeast from town passed directly by the Kendrick Ranch gate. Amos pulled up to call out a greeting, because Amos greeted everyone on every road in Sumner County as a matter of personal policy, and Matthew Kendrick came to the fence and looked over. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that had not been introduced to a razor in 3 or 4 days. He wore a blue work shirt and canvas trousers and boots that were worn down at the left heel in a way that suggested he favored that side when he planted himself. His eyes were a pale, clear gray, the color of sky just before it makes up its mind about the weather. "Amos," he said. "Morning, Matthew. Got a new neighbor for you. This here is Mrs. Doyle. She filed a homestead claim on the Chester parcel this morning." Matthew's eyes moved to Louise. She met them directly because she had decided some years ago that looking away first was a habit she could not afford. "Ma'am," he said. "Mr. Kendrick," she said, because Amos had used his name and she had filed it away. "That land hasn't been worked in 4 years," Matthew said. It was not unkind, just factual. "The old sod house the Chester boy built is still standing, but barely. The well went dry 2 summers ago." "Then I'll need to dig a new one," Louise said. He studied her for a moment. "You got people coming out to help you?" "No. You got tools?" She hesitated because she did not in any meaningful way, and lying seemed impractical. "I have a skillet," she said. Something happened at the corner of Matthew Kendrick's mouth. It might have been the beginning of a smile, or it might have been just a rearrangement of thought. He looked at Amos, then back at Louise. "I've got a spare hand shovel, some fencing wire, and a bag of flour I can send over," he said. "And I know where the good water table runs. I can come show you where to dig." Louise looked at him steadily. "I don't take charity." "I know it," he said, as if this were already understood. "We're going to be neighbors. That's not charity, that's just sense. Bad neighbors make bad country." She considered this for a moment, turning it over for any trick in it and finding none. "All right," she said. "I'll pay it back in kind when I've got something to pay with." "Fair enough," Matthew Kendrick said, and went back to his gelding. The sod house was worse than Louise had hoped and better than she had feared. The walls held, which was the most important thing, and the roof had lost 2 spots of its grass thatching that could be patched. The inside was dark and smelled of abandonment, but when she opened the one small window and the door together, a cross breeze came through that made it feel livable. She swept the dirt floor, reset the stones of the fireplace with the help of a rusted iron poker she found in the corner, and had the space habitable by the time evening fell. Matthew Kendrick came the next morning as he said he would, leading a mule loaded with tools, not just the hand shovel but a full set of farming implements, a post-hole digger, and a length of rope. He brought his ranch hand, a Mexican man named Silvio Vega who spoke careful English, and moved with the efficiency of someone who had been working land his entire life. Silvio was quiet and gentle-mannered and treated Louise, with the kind of straightforward respect that made her feel like a person instead of a problem. They spent the morning walking the property while Matthew explained the lay of the land, where the water table ran shallow in the east corner, how the drainage went, what the soil composition was in the different quadrants of the claim. He talked about it the way he talked about everything, plainly, without ornament, giving information the way a man gives water when water is needed. Louise listened and asked good questions. He noticed the questions, though he did not say so. By noon they had identified the well site. By late afternoon they had dug 6 feet and struck water. Louise stood at the edge of the hole and looked down at the dark gleam of it and felt something release in her chest that had been coiled tight since February. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it in the full and specific way that people mean things when they have been genuinely helped. Matthew looked at the well, not at her. "The soil out here in the south quarter is going to be good for planting. Gets the right light. What are you planning to grow?" She pulled the paper envelope from her apron pocket. "Tomatoes to start. I need to trade for the rest corn seed, beans, squash if I can find it." He glanced at the envelope. 20-some seeds won't feed a winter." "Know that," she said, "but they'll produce fruit and I'll save from those, and next year I'll have more, and I'll find work between now and harvest to cover what I need." He thought about this. "I pay Silvio and 2 other hands through the summer. I could use a 4th, mostly for the kitchen work and vegetable garden at the ranch. It doesn't pay much, but it's steady." She looked at him. "Are you giving me a job or are you still being a neighbor?" "Both," he said honestly. "Doesn't have to be one or the other." She worked for Matthew Kendrick 3 days a week through April and into May. The arrangement was practical and they kept it that way. She rode over on his spare horse, a slow-paint mare named Molasses who had opinions about mud, did the cooking and the kitchen garden and the mending that needed doing, and came home in the evenings to her own place with 25 cents a day in her pocket and her arms tired in the satisfying way that comes from useful work. She planted her tomato seeds in late April in a carefully prepared bed in the south-facing corner of her property, with a low windbreak of salvaged lumber she had bought from the feed store in Caldwell. She planted them the way her mother had taught her, pressing each seed into the earth with her thumb and covering it with the precise amount of soil, and then she stood up and looked at the bare ground and felt the particular courage that farming requires, the courage of believing in things you cannot yet see. The ranch house was a real house, made of timber and stone, with a kitchen that had a proper stove and a table long enough to seat 8. Louise found herself noticing things about it on a daily basis. The way Matthew had built the shelves in the kitchen at a height that made sense, the way the windows were placed to catch the morning light, the way the whole structure had been put together by someone who was thinking clearly about how a life would be lived in it. It was the house of a man who thought about things quietly and thoroughly and built them to last. Matthew was not easy to know. He said what he meant, but he did not say everything that he meant, which was a distinction Louise came to understand gradually. He was most himself around the horses and the land, and she found that watching him with both those things told her more about him than any conversation in the kitchen. He was also, she noticed, not a man who was comfortable being watched. He knew his land and his animals and his business, and he carried that knowledge with a quiet confidence that was not arrogance. But when she looked at him directly for too long, he tended to find something else to look at, and she found this oddly interesting in a man who was otherwise so composed. One afternoon in May, when the wind was hard from the west, and she was battling the kitchen garden's new row of bean plants against it with a string and 2 stakes, he came around the corner of the house and saw her down on her knees in the dirt with her hair half escaped from its pins and her apron covered in soil. He stopped and watched her work for a moment without speaking. "You want to fight me for those stakes, or are you just standing there for atmosphere?" she said without looking up. He laughed. It was a genuine sound, surprised out of him, and it changed his whole face. He came down on one knee beside her and held the stake while she tied the string, and they worked in silence for a few minutes with the wind pulling at both of them. "Your tomatoes are coming up," he said. She paused. "How do you know that?" Rode past your place yesterday afternoon, saw the seedlings in the south bed. She looked at him. He was looking at the bean plant. You were checking on me, she said. He was quiet for a moment. I check on all the properties that share my fence line. I don't share your fence line. Another pause. No, he agreed and said nothing else, and she let it sit. Something had begun between them that neither of them was naming yet. It was like the water beneath her land. It had been there before they looked for it, and finding it did not create it, only revealed it. May in Kansas in 1878 was a season of violent contradictions. Warm days that smelled of new grass and wild plum blossom, followed by nights cold enough to make you believe winter had not truly left. Louise had learned early to check the sky at dusk every day with the specific eye of someone whose livelihood depended on what came down from it. She had also learned that the prairie had its own kind of beauty, grand and indifferent and enormous, that you either came to terms with or you didn't, and the ones who didn't came to pieces against it. She was learning to love it slowly, the way you learn to love something that makes no effort to be loved. On the 15th of May, she had a visitor she was not expecting. A woman named Harriet Blaine arrived at her sod house on a wagon driven by her eldest son, carrying a covered dish and wearing the expression of someone conducting an official survey. Harriet was the wife of the largest dry goods merchant in Caldwell, and she was the kind of woman who arrived at your door before you had a chance to invite her, and considered this a form of generosity. I heard you were out here alone, Harriet said, surveying the exterior of the sod house with the particular look of someone cataloging its shortcomings. I wanted to make sure you had everything you needed. I have what I need, Louise said, which was mostly true. Harriet came inside anyway and looked around and left a casserole dish of something that turned out to be overcooked venison stew, and then she sat at the small table Louise had salvaged from behind the general store and said what she had actually come to say. People are talking, she said, about you working over at the Kendrick place. Louise poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the fire and set one in front of Harriet without comment. There are folks who think it's not entirely proper, Harriet continued, wrapping her hands around the cup. A widow woman, no chaperone. I work in a kitchen and a garden, Louise said, in daylight, with Silvio Vega present every hour. I know that, dear. I'm just telling you what's said. I appreciate the warning, Louise said, in a tone that indicated she did not especially intend to do anything about it. Harriet looked at her for a long moment, and then something softened in her expression. He's a good man, Matthew Kendrick, she said, and this time it did not sound like a warning. He's a very private man and a very careful one, but he's good. Louise wrapped her hands around her own cup. I know he is. She said it before she had time to think about whether she was saying too much, and then she did not take it back because it was true. That evening, she sat on the step of her sod house, as the sun went down behind the flat western horizon, in a burn of orange and pink that looked like something out of a painting that was trying too hard to impress you. The prairie was quiet in the particular way it was quiet at dusk, with just the low sound of the wind through the grass and the distant complaint of a nighthawk somewhere to the north. She thought about Daniel. She did this every evening still, consciously, the way you perform a small act of remembrance to make sure the thing being remembered does not get lost. She thought about his hands and the way he smelled like sawdust because he had worked at the mill, and the way he had said her name, Lou, not Louise, always Lou, and the way the chair had looked empty for weeks after he was gone. She did not feel guilty about noticing Matthew Kendrick. She thought Daniel would have recognized the quality in him immediately, because Daniel had been good at recognizing quality in people. What she felt was something more complicated, a tenderness for a man she did not yet know well enough to trust with tenderness, and an alertness in herself that she had not expected to feel again. She went to bed when the stars were fully out and lay listening to the prairie sounds, and thought about seeds underground in the dark and about the nature of patience. In June, the summer heat arrived, and the cattle drives came through, and Caldwell swelled with drovers and noise, and the particular restless energy of men who had been on a trail for 2 months and were now in proximity to a saloon. Louise worked her land in the early mornings and evenings when the heat was tolerable and rested in the middle hours. Her tomato seedlings had grown into true plants now, sturdy and reaching, and she had traded labor with a neighbor 3 miles east, a family named Brant for corn seed and bean seed, and enough squash seed to plant a respectable row. Matthew had also given her, without being asked, a barrel of stored cornmeal and a smoked ham that he said was surplus from winter stores. She had accepted both with the condition that she would cook 2 extra dinners per week as payment, and he had agreed to this so quickly that she suspected he had been looking for an excuse to offer the supplies. Those dinners became the best part of her week, though she did not admit this to anyone, including herself, for some time. Cooking at the ranch house in the long June evenings, while the light came through the kitchen windows at a golden angle, and Matthew sat at the table going through his ledgers. She had noticed he kept careful books, columns of numbers in a clear hand, was something she found herself looking forward to in a way that had nothing to do with the 25 cents a day. He talked to her differently in those evenings than he did during the workday hours. The work was done, the hands had gone to the bunkhouse, and there was just the 2 of them and the sound of the stove and the occasional horse moving in the corral outside. He told her about Tennessee, the green of it, the hills, the way his father had talked about Kansas as if it were the promised land, and then spent his first winter here wondering what he had said. He told her about the years of building the ranch, the winters that were hard, the one summer in 1874 when the grasshoppers had come and eaten everything, literally everything, crops and grass, and the wooden handles of tools if you left them in the field long enough. "Did you think about leaving?" she asked. He considered the question seriously, as he considered all questions. "I thought about it for about 3 days," he said. "And then I decided that the thing that wanted to make me leave was the same thing that had been trying to make me leave since I first got here, the difficulty, and I didn't think I should let difficulty make my decisions." Louise set a plate in front of him, fried salt pork and gravy and biscuits, and looked at him directly. "I know exactly what you mean," she said. He looked up at her, and for a moment there was something between them that was clear and quiet and honest as the water in the new well, and then he looked down at his plate and she went back to the stove, and neither of them said anything else about it that night. But she felt it. She felt it the way you feel a change in weather before the sky gives any sign of it. The 4th of July celebration in Caldwell was a serious affair. There was a parade of sorts, mostly horses and one very patriotic wagon, and a picnic in the church grounds, and a speech from the mayor who had been practicing it since late May and was determined to use all of it regardless of the temperature. Louise went with Harriet Blaine, who had appointed herself Louise's social sponsor with or without being asked. Matthew came with Silvio and his other hands, a young man named Pete Calloway who was 19 and earnest, and a hand named Dwight Foster who was somewhere in his 40s, and spoke in complete sentences only when strictly necessary. Louise saw Matthew across the church grounds and they exchanged a nod, which was the appropriate thing, and then spent the next hour very carefully not watching each other with a thoroughness that told everyone who was watching both of them exactly what was happening. Harriet watched with a small, satisfied expression. It was during the picnic that Tommy Reeves made his appearance. He was one of the trail drovers, passing through with a herd from Texas, and he had a sunburned neck and the specific confidence of a man who has been told he is charming by enough women to believe it. He sat down beside Louise on the church steps without being invited and offered her a slice of watermelon and called her "Pretty Miss," in a way that was more habit than sincere. She thanked him politely for the watermelon and made it clear within about 4 sentences that she was not interested. He pressed a little further, the way a certain kind of man does when clarity does not suit him, and it was in the middle of this that Matthew appeared beside them with 2 glasses of lemonade. He had been standing at the refreshment table 20 feet away and covered the distance with a speed that was not quite hurried but was definitely purposeful. "Mrs. Doyle," he said, and handed her a glass. "Mr. Kendrick," she said, taking it. Tommy Reeves looked up at Matthew Kendrick, who was standing with the specific stillness of a large and unhurried man who has made up his mind about something. "You a friend of hers?" Tommy asked. "I am," Matthew said. Simply, certainly, as if it were a fact about the weather. Tommy Reeves reconsidered the direction of his afternoon and eventually stood up and went to find someone else to offer watermelon to. Louise sipped her lemonade. Matthew sat down beside her, taking the spot Tommy had vacated, and for a moment they both looked out at the picnic. "I can handle myself," she said. "I know you can," he said. "So you weren't rescuing me." "I was bringing you lemonade," he said. "I can go put it back if you like." She turned and looked at him, and he was looking straight ahead with an expression that was almost perfectly composed, except for something at the corner of his eye that was not quite suppressed. "You are aggravating," she said. "I've been told," he said. She laughed, and it felt like something releasing in her ribs, and he turned and looked at her then, and his expression was entirely unguarded for a moment, entirely open. And what was in it was something she recognized because she had been feeling it herself for weeks. He looked away first, back to the picnic. She looked down at her lemonade. "Thank you," she said quietly, and she was not talking about the lemonade. "You're welcome," he said, and she knew he understood. In late July, Louise's tomato plants bore fruit for the first time. She had tended them through June's heat and the early July thunderstorms that had knocked two of them sideways and required restaking. And one morning she went out to the south bed and found 3 tomatoes turned red overnight, clustered on the tallest plant. And she stood in the early morning light and looked at them and felt something so profound move through her that she had to press the back of her hand to her mouth. She was going to be all right. Here, on this land, in this life she was building out of $43 and a handful of seeds, she was going to be all right. She picked the 3 tomatoes and put 2 of them in her apron and rode molasses to the Kendrick ranch. Matthew was in the barn when she arrived, working on a saddle repair with a curved needle and heavy thread. He looked up when she came in and she held out the tomato. "First one," she said. He set down the needle and took it from her hand, and his fingers were warm and his eyes were steady on hers. "That's something," he said, and he meant it in the way people mean things when they are actually moved by them and are not practiced enough at pretending not to be. "It is," she agreed. He turned the tomato over in his hands, looking at it the way he looked at good things, carefully, with full attention. "Come have coffee," he said. They sat at the kitchen table and she sliced the tomato with his kitchen knife and they ate it with salt, and it tasted like the warmest, ripest, most impossible thing either of them had put in their mouths in as long as they could remember. "It's good," he said. "It is," she said. They looked at each other across the table. The kitchen was quiet and the morning light was full, and the moment held between them the way a breath holds before it becomes a word. "Louise," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. She knew immediately from the way he said it, careful and certain and a little rough at the edges, like a thing you have practiced to yourself in the dark, what was about to happen, and she sat very still. "I want to say something, and I want to say it plainly because I don't do well with going around things." "All right," she said. "I think about you," he said. "More than is probably sensible given that you came here as a neighbor and an employee, and I'm aware of that. You're not long from losing your husband, and I don't have any intention of making your situation more complicated than it already is. But I think about you a great deal, and I think you should know it." The kitchen was very quiet. "How long have you thought about me?" she asked. He thought about it honestly, which she had expected him to do. "Since the day you told Amos you had a skillet," he said. She pressed her lips together around something that was both a laugh and something more tender than a laugh. "Matthew," she said, and his name in her mouth had the same quality his had had in his practiced, careful cert. "I think about you too." He was quiet, absorbing this. "I'm not the easiest person," he said. "I know that. I keep to myself more than most. The ranch takes everything I've got some seasons, and I'm 34 years old and said in more ways than I should be at my age. I'm a widow with 23 tomato seeds and a strong opinion about everything, she said. I don't know that you're the one who should be apologizing for the complications. He looked at her, and what was in his eyes now was unguarded and direct and warm, and it made her want to look away, and she did not look away. Could we take some time, he asked. Get to know each other properly the way it should be done. I'm not asking for anything more than that, just time. Yes, she said. I think that's right. And so they began, openly but quietly, to court. It was an old-fashioned word for something that was not entirely old-fashioned in its execution. He rode over to her property on Sunday afternoons, and they walked the land together and talked. She went to the ranch on her working days, and they ate dinner together after the hands retired. He brought her things she needed, not as gifts, but as practical transfers of necessary items. And she repaid them in labor and meals, and the particular quality of her company, which he came to need the way you come to need something you did not know was missing. She told him about Missouri and her childhood and her mother's garden, and the way her father had died when she was 12, and how her mother had raised 5 children alone after that with the iron determination of a woman who simply refused to consider the alternative. She told him about Daniel honestly, completely, not flinching from the tenderness of it, and Matthew listened in the way he listened to everything fully, without looking away. I loved him, she said one Sunday afternoon when they were sitting at the edge of her property on the 2 salvaged wooden chairs she had set up facing west because she had decided that watching sunsets was a thing she was going to continue to do as long as she lived. I want you to know I don't say his name carefully around you because I'm ashamed of loving him. I say it carefully because I want to be fair to both of you. You can say his name, Matthew said. He was your husband. He was your life. I'm not competing with a dead man, Louise. I'm just trying to be the man who's here. She turned and looked at him, and something shifted in her that was permanent, some final piece of grief. Not letting go of Daniel, but releasing the weight of carrying him incorrectly. Releasing the idea that loving someone new was a betrayal of someone gone. She reached out and put her hand over his where it rested on the arm of the chair, and he turned his hand over and closed his fingers around hers. And they sat that way while the sun went down in its extravagant Kansas fashion, and the prairie darkened around them. And it was one of the most quietly profound things Louise Doyle had experienced since she had arrived in Kansas with $43 and a handful of seeds. August came in hot and relentless. The work of the land doubled, harvesting what was ready, preserving what could be preserved, preparing for what was coming. Louise's tomato plants were producing abundantly now, great heavy clusters of fruit that she picked every other morning and either ate fresh or processed in her large pot over the fire, filling jar after jar with the red, savory heat of them. Her corn was coming in, not a full crop but a solid one for a first-year farm. The beans had done well. The squash had done so well that she found herself with more than she could use and began selling the surplus to the general store in Caldwell. The money was small, but it was real, and every coin of it felt like something she had made with her own hands from the earth, which was exactly what it was. She also began saving the best tomato seeds from the finest fruits, pressing them carefully onto scraps of cloth to dry, and then folding them into paper envelopes the way her mother had taught her. By the end of August, she had 47 seeds, nearly double what she had started with. She held them in her palm one evening and thought about her mother, and about her own hands in the soil, and about the way things grow in directions you do not always plan. Matthew helped her on the weekends when the ranch allowed it. He was good with physical labor in the way that comes from a life lived in it, efficient, strong, intuitive about how things fit together. He could look at a piece of broken fence or a poorly hung door and immediately see what the problem was and how to fix it. He had spent one August Saturday replacing the rotted frame of her sod house window with a proper timber frame and a new glass pane he had brought from the hardware in Caldwell. And when it was done, the light in the room changed entirely, and Louise had stood looking at it with her hand over her mouth. not because it was fancy, but because it was kind. One afternoon, while she was picking tomatoes and he was repairing her fence, the east section had been knocked sideways by a wandering longhorn that had strayed from a passing drive. He asked her something that surprised him as much as it surprised her. "Did you ever want children?" he asked, and then immediately looked like he was considering whether that had been too much to ask. Louise kept picking. "Yes," she said. "Daniel and I hoped for them. It didn't happen for us." That was its own grief on top of the other. She paused. "Did you?" He drove a fence post with careful precision. "I thought about it less as I got older and the ranch got bigger," he said. "But I think I was mostly not thinking about it right. I was thinking about children as a thing you had rather than a thing you shared." She looked at him over the top of the tomato plant. "That is an unexpectedly honest thing to say." "You make honesty seem like the sensible choice," he said, and went back to the fence. She put another tomato in the basket and thought about what he had said for the rest of the afternoon, and decided it was true. In September, Silvio Vega broke his wrist when a horse threw him in the East Corral. It was a clean break, but it put him out of commission for 6 weeks, and Matthew was running short-handed at exactly the wrong time of year, because September was when the late-season cattle sales happened, and the ranch needed full capacity. Louise offered to take on more hours, covering not just the kitchen work but the lighter outdoor work Silvio usually handled, the feed runs, the garden maintenance, the supply organization that kept the whole operation moving. It meant she was at the ranch from early morning until late afternoon 4 days a week, and it meant she and Matthew spent more time in each other's company than they had before, working side by side in the particular way of people who know each other well enough to be quiet together without it feeling like absence. It was during these weeks that things deepened. Not in any sudden or dramatic way, but in the way that real things deepen, gradually, through accumulation, through 100 small moments of being known and knowing. He knew how she took her coffee. She knew the particular expression he wore when a problem had been solved, not proud, just settled, like a door that has finally been hung correctly. He knew that she sang very quietly while she worked, and that she was not aware she was doing it. She knew that he went to the barn late at night when he couldn't sleep, that she had seen the lantern light from her property on clear nights and known what it meant without being told. She knew that he was lonely. Not the manic, restless loneliness of a man who doesn't know what he needs, but the deep, quiet loneliness of a man who knows exactly what he needs and has spent years being too careful to reach for it. One evening in mid-September, she stayed later than usual because a thunderstorm came up from the south while she was still at the ranch, the kind that moved fast and hit hard, and Matthew insisted she stay until it passed rather than ride home in it. The hands came in from the bunkhouse for dinner, and the whole table was full for once. Pete Calloway talking too much the way young men do when they are comfortable, Dwight Foster saying almost nothing, Silvio cradling his splinted wrist and making suggestions about the bean soup that Louise had made that no one could argue with because they were correct. After dinner, the hands went back to the bunkhouse in the clearing rain, and Matthew and Louise washed up together at the kitchen basin, a domestic, ordinary thing that felt entirely right, and then she stood at the kitchen window looking out at the wet, dark prairie while he put the clean dishes away. "I don't want to go home," she said, and then immediately felt how that had sounded and turned around. "I mean, the evening is so much nicer here than—" "I know what you mean," he said. He was standing near the shelf where the dishes went, and he was looking at her with that particular unguarded expression she had come to know, the one he wore when he had decided not to hide anything. "Louise," he said. "Matthew," she said. He crossed the kitchen and stopped close enough that she could have reached out and put her hand flat on his chest if she had chosen to, and she was absolutely aware of this, and she was aware that he was aware of it. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want to ask it properly." She waited, breathing. "I am asking," he said, Because I know what I feel, and I believe I know what you feel, and I'm 34 years old, and I'm not a man who plays games with serious things. I would like to court you with the full intention of asking you to marry me. Not tonight, not tomorrow, when the time is right and you're ready, if you ever are. But I want you to know what my intention is, because I think you deserve to know. The rain was dripping softly from the porch roof. The kitchen smelled of bean soup and wood smoke and the clean smell of after-storm. Yes, she said, I would like that. He exhaled, and the exhale was so clearly the release of something long held that it made her heart ache in the best possible way. All right, he said, and his voice was different, warmer, and not quite steady in a way she had never heard from him before. She reached out and put her hand flat on his chest, over his heart, the way she had been thinking about, and felt the beat of it under her palm. He put his hand over hers and pressed it there gently. They stood in the kitchen with the rain clearing outside and the last light of the storm-broken evening coming through the window, and it was the most natural thing in the world and also the most extraordinary. October arrived with its great cold clarity. The sky in Kansas in October is a specific shade of blue that does not appear any other time of year, deep and absolute, like the sky has decided to make a final argument about beauty before winter closes in. Louise's fields were harvested and she was deep in the work of winter preparation, filling the root cellar she and Matthew had dug together in late September, preserving and drying and preparing for the cold months. The tomato seeds. She had 73 now. She had counted twice to be sure, more than 3 times what she had arrived with in the spring. She kept them in a small cedar box that Matthew had made for her, a simple thing with a fitted lid, and she kept it on the shelf above her bed where she could see it every morning. She and Matthew began to be open about their courtship in the way that small towns require and also monitor very closely. There were Sunday services where they sat in the same pew, which caused Harriet Blaine to look extremely satisfied, and there were the evenings in Caldwell when Matthew walked with her from the general store to the livery and people saw and nodded and drew their own conclusions, which were correct. The one person who had something to say about it that Louise had not been prepared for was Pete Calloway, who said it unexpectedly one afternoon in the ranch yard. He had been raking the yard and Louise was passing through with a basket of mending, and he said without looking up, "Mr. Kendrick's different this year." Louise paused. "Different how?" Pete kept raking. He was 19 and not entirely sure how to have conversations that mattered, but he was trying. "Easier, I guess. He used to be tight, like a rope with too much tension. Since you've been around, he's easier." Louise looked at the young man with his honest face and his rake. "Thank you, Pete," she said, and meant it. She thought about that for a long time, about what it meant to make a careful, contained man easier to be. About what that said not just about her but about him. About the fact that he was not in fact the impenetrable thing he sometimes appeared. That under the careful composure was a man who needed, genuinely, someone to let that composure down with. She wanted to be that person. She found, thinking about it plainly, that she wanted it very much. One evening in late October, Matthew drove her to the low rise south of town that had the best view of the prairie at sunset. The way she had told him in one of their early conversations was her favorite thing about Kansas, that you could see the whole world from certain rises, and that the sunsets looked made by someone showing off. He had remembered this without being reminded, and brought her there in the wagon on a Friday evening, and they sat on the wagon bench together with a blanket across their knees, because the October evenings were properly cold now, and watched the sun go down in all its theatrical glory. "I want to tell you something," she said, while the sky was still burning. "Tell me," he said. "When I came here in March, I had $38 and some seeds, and I had never farmed on my own in my life, and I wasn't entirely sure I was going to be able to do it." She paused. "I was scared, more scared than I let on, though I didn't let on much." "I know," he said gently. "I could see it." She looked at him. "And you helped me anyway. Not because you felt sorry for me or because you wanted something from me, but because it was right. Because bad neighbors make bad country." She smiled at the phrase. "You helped me because you're a man who does the right thing quietly without needing to be congratulated for it." "Louise, I want to say this," she said. "I'm almost done. I came here to make a life, and I think I have done that. The homestead is real. The harvest happened. The seeds are multiplying. But the life I've made is more than I planned for. It has more in it than I planned for. You are more than I planned for." She turned and looked at him fully in the last of the sunset light. "I love you." I wanted to say it plainly, the way you like things said. He was still for a moment, completely still, and then he turned to her and his gray eyes were very clear and very near and very warm. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since at least July, probably longer, possibly since the skillet. I wasn't going to say it first because I thought it was too soon and you had enough weight to carry without adding mine." She laughed, and tears were on her face suddenly, which surprised her. "We have been very careful with each other," she said. "We have," he agreed. "I think we can stop." He reached out and put his hand along her jaw, very gently, the way you touch something you do not want to break, and he kissed her. It was a careful kiss at first, and then it was not careful, and the prairie was enormous and dark around them, and the stars were coming out, and his hand was warm against her face, and she put her hands against his chest, and kissed him back with everything she had been carrying carefully all these months. When they stopped, he rested his forehead against hers, and she could feel him breathing, uneven and warm. "Marry me," he said. "Not as a question to be thought about. I'm asking you now. I know it's faster than I said it would be, but I know what I know and I know what you just said, and I don't see any reason to be careful about it anymore." She pulled back just enough to see his face. His expression was fully open, nothing held back, all of the careful composure set aside. He looked in this moment younger and more certain and more beautiful than she had any framework for. "Yes," she said. "Matthew, yes." He let out a long breath and then smiled at her, a full and real and unguarded smile, and she thought she might need to sit down, and she was already sitting, and it was good that she was. They drove back to town under the full October stars, sitting closer on the wagon bench than was strictly necessary for steering purposes, and Caldwell was lit up with its evening lamps, and Harriet Blaine happened to be on the main street and happened to look at them and happened to see everything she needed to see, and her expression of complete satisfaction could have lit an additional lamp. The wedding was set for the first Saturday of November, which gave them 3 weeks and was not a great deal of time, but was sufficient time to do what needed doing. Louise went to the church with Harriet, who was thrilled to be of use, and arranged the ceremony with the Reverend. Matthew went to the bank and arranged the legal matters that needed arranging with respect to the homestead claim, which would be maintained in Louise's name with the full rights of the property. He insisted on this, which she found important and right. She wore the best dress she owned, which was a dark green wool that had been her mother's best dress before it was hers, and Harriet Blaine had pressed it beautifully and added a simple collar of white ribbon. She had her hair properly pinned with 2 tortoiseshell combs that had been among the things in the carpet bag. Not an heirloom exactly, but a kept thing, kept because they were her mother's. She held a small bunch of the last late October wildflowers, prairie asters in pale purple, that Pete Calloway had picked without being asked, and left on the church step that morning with no note, because he was 19 and not practiced at sentiment, but felt it anyway. Matthew stood at the front of the church in a dark coat she had not seen before, clearly purchased for the occasion, and a white shirt, and a string tie that he wore with the slight discomfort of a man who does not normally concern himself with string ties. He had shaved. His gray eyes were on her from the moment she came through the church door, and they did not waver. She walked down the aisle of the small church with the November light coming through the plain glass windows and the Reverend Tillman standing at the front looking pleased, and she looked at Matthew Kendrick standing there waiting for her with everything he was visible in his face, and she thought, here, this is where the seeds were always going. They spoke their vows to each other in the old words, meaning every syllable, and when Matthew took her hand in his at the moment of the ring, he held it with such steadiness and such care that she had to breathe very deliberately to keep herself composed. He put the ring on her finger, a simple gold band, plain and good, and she put the matching band on his. And Reverend Tillman said the words that made it true, and Matthew kissed her gently in front of the whole congregation, including Silvio with his newly healed wrist and Pete Calloway, who was bright red with something between emotion and embarrassment, and Dwight Foster, who said nothing, but had clearly combed his hair for the occasion. The celebration after was at the ranch house, which Harriet had helped organize with the efficient determination of a woman who had organized 15 years of church socials, and was not going to let a wedding reception fall short. There was enough food for twice the people present, and enough whiskey for a cattle drive, and the evening went long with the kind of noise and warmth that a house makes when it is genuinely full. Late in the evening, when the guests had gone and the ranch house was quiet, Louise stood in the kitchen washing the last of the dishes in the lamplight and heard Matthew come up behind her. He put his arms around her from behind and rested his chin on the top of her head. "You're washing dishes on our wedding night," he said. "I won't sleep if I leave a mess," she said. "I know," he said, with the ease of someone who genuinely knows something about the person they are talking to. He let go of her and picked up a dishcloth and started drying what she was washing, and they finished the dishes together in the lamplight. The winter came. The winter in Kansas is not gentle, but it can be survived and even loved if you are prepared for it and are not facing it alone. Louise was both. She had her root cellar full of her own harvest tomatoes and squash and dried beans and corn, and she had the ranch house with its good stove and its deep-set windows and Matthew beside her. She moved her things from the sod house formally: the carpet bag, the cast iron skillet, the cedar box of seeds, the 2 tortoiseshell combs. She left the sod house itself in good repair because it was still hers, on her homestead claim, and she had not spent a spring building it and a summer shoring it up to abandon it carelessly. She had plans for it that were still forming. The winter months were something she had not expected. She had thought she knew what winter could be. Missouri winters were cold and long, but she had not factored in the specific quality of winter on the ranch, which was busy in a different way from summer. All the internal work, the management of the animals, the repair and preparation, and in the evenings the particular warmth of a house that 2 people inhabited together, the small negotiations and accommodations and discoveries that constitute actually sharing a life with someone. She learned that Matthew slept with startling stillness, that he woke before dawn by internal habit without needing to be woken, and that he always had coffee ready when she came downstairs, which she came to understand over time was a form of love he had been practicing in private long before they married. She learned that he hated the dark months not for the cold but for the short light, that he was a man made for outdoors, and that the long indoor evenings sometimes made him restless, and that the best thing for this restlessness was company and conversation, which she could provide in abundance. He learned, in turn, that she was fiercely independent in ways that occasionally created unnecessary difficulty, and that the way to handle this was not to argue it, but to let her arrive at her own conclusions, which were generally correct and generally arrived at faster if he didn't argue. He learned that she missed Daniel less in sadness, and more in the way you miss something that was good and is gone, a fact and not a wound, and that the best thing was to let her say his name when she needed to and not make it heavy. In the evenings she read to him from the few books they had between them. She had 3. He had 4, 7 books being a reasonable library for a ranch in Kansas in 1878. She read well, with attention to the sound of the words, and he listened in the way he listened to music, with his eyes closed and his hands still. January was the hardest month, the deep cold, and in January Louise discovered that she was expecting. She did not tell Matthew immediately, not because she wanted to hide it but because she wanted to be certain, and then she wanted one morning with the certainty before it became shared. She sat at the kitchen table in the early light while he was still in the barn, and held the fact of it in her hands like a found thing, tender and enormous and impossibly right. When he came in for breakfast, she was standing at the stove, and she turned around and looked at him, and he saw it in her face immediately before she said a word. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and stood close and looked at her. "Louise," he said, and his voice was already different. "In the summer, I think," she said. "I think July." He put his hands on either side of her face and looked at her for a long moment with his gray eyes very full, and then he pulled her close and held her there in the kitchen with the stove warm at their backs and the January wind at the windows, and she felt his breath in her hair. "July," he said, like a word from a language that suddenly makes sense. She held on to him and felt the future settle itself around them like something right. Spring came again. The world greened and the meadowlarks returned to the fence posts, and the cattle on the Kendrick range lifted their heavy heads in the warming air, and the work of the land reasserted itself with all its particular demands and rewards. Louise's homestead claim land got its second season of planting, this time with proper resources, proper tools, and a full supply of seed that included the now considerable population of her tomato seeds, which numbered 112, enough to plant 2 full beds and still have a reserve. She did the planting herself, on her hands and knees in the south-facing bed she had prepared 2 years running now, pressing each seed into the warm earth with her thumb, covering them, tending them. Matthew helped at the weekend, but this part she did alone, because some work needs to be done by the person who has the longest claim on it. Silvio came over to help with the heavier work, and treated her expanding pregnancy with a kind of gentle, matter-of-fact courtesy that she appreciated enormously. Pete Calloway was visibly nervous around her, and tried not to look at her midsection while talking to her, which she found endearing. Dwight Foster said nothing about it at all, which, from Dwight, meant he approved entirely. Harriet Blaine appeared with a crocheted blanket and information about what to expect that was simultaneously more and less useful than Louise would have liked, but the blanket was beautiful and she kept it. Matthew was not hovering, but he was present in a heightened way, the way a careful man is present when something precious is involved. He was careful without being suffocating, which took a particular kind of self-control. He also began, quietly and without announcing it, to work on the sod house on Louise's claim. She found out about it in May when she rode Molasses over to check on the late-planted squash and found him there with Pete, framing out an addition to the existing structure. "What are you building?" she asked, dismounting with the careful negotiation required at nearly 7 months. "A proper room on the east side," he said. "Stone foundation. It'll keep better through winter." She looked at the structure taking shape, solid and well-designed. "What's the room for?" she asked. He kept his eyes on the framing. "You said once that you wanted to keep the homestead in use, that you didn't want it to just sit. I thought if we got the right person, a family who needed a start, someone new off the stage who needed shelter and a place to work while they found their feet." He looked at her then. "It's what we had, what you had. I thought we could give it forward." She stood in the Kansas spring morning with her hand on her belly and looked at her husband building a shelter for strangers who did not yet exist, who would arrive someday the way she had arrived, with a carpetbag and a need, and a stubborn intention to make something from it. She walked over and put her hand on the stone he was setting and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that was adequate, and he looked at her and understood that, and they shared the moment cleanly and completely, the way they had learned to share things. The baby came on the 12th of July, 1879. A boy. 7 pounds and some ounces, according to Doc Mercer's practiced estimation, with dark hair and gray eyes that were his father's in no uncertain terms. Matthew was there. He had refused to be anywhere else, regardless of what custom suggested about where fathers stood during such things, and Doc Mercer had raised an eyebrow and then shrugged, because Matthew Kendrick was generally going to do what he decided to do, and the eyebrow was largely symbolic. When the boy arrived in the world and announced himself with the full and vigorous opinion of a healthy newborn, Matthew Kendrick, who had built a ranch from 40 acres and broken horses that nobody else could break and survived grasshoppers and drought and Kansas winters and 34 years of being fundamentally alone, put his face in his hands, and made a sound that was not like any sound Louise had ever heard him make. She was exhausted and sweating, and she had never been more certain of anything in her life. "Come here," she said. He came to the bedside and looked at the baby in her arms, and his gray eyes were overflowing in the way of a man who does not cry frequently but is crying now and has made no arrangement to hide it. "Hello," he said to the baby, in the specific soft voice that people use with newborns, the voice that arrives instinctively regardless of whether you have been waiting for it. "His name," Louise said, "if you agree, is James." Matthew looked at her. "James Kendrick," he said, testing it. "James Daniel Kendrick," she said, "if that's all right." His jaw worked for a moment. "Daniel. He was a good man," she said, "and it was a good name, and our son should have good things." Matthew reached out and put one finger very carefully against the baby's cheek. "James Daniel Kendrick," he said, and his voice was low and certain and full of the particular quality of a man who is receiving more than he knew how to ask for. "Yes," said Louise. The summer passed in the full and wonderful chaos of a ranch with a new baby, which is to say that nothing stopped because the cattle did not care about the baby, and the horses did not care about the baby, and the land certainly did not care about the baby. And so the work continued in all its demands, but it continued around a center that was warm and loud and increasingly opinionated as August wore on. Pete Calloway turned out to be unexpectedly gifted with babies. He would hold James with complete confidence when Louise needed her hands free, walking the length of the bunkhouse or the yard with the infant tucked in the crook of his arm, talking to him with easy nonsense about the weather and the horses. And James generally stopped complaining when Pete held him, which Pete took as a personal distinction. Silvio brought a carved wooden horse on a stick from his own childhood, passed through years and miles, and the particular dignity of a man's careful keeping. He presented it to James with a brief speech in Spanish that Louise could not fully follow but understood in its entirety, and Matthew shook his hand in the way of men who have worked beside each other for years and trust each other completely. Dwight Foster, on one memorable September evening, picked James up from his blanket on the porch without being asked, held him against his chest, and stood looking out at the sunset for 10 minutes in perfect silence. Then he set the baby back down, said, "Good boy," in his normal spare fashion, and walked back to the bunkhouse. This was the most emotional thing Dwight had done in anyone's recent memory, and it was discussed quietly among the other hands with appropriate respect. Louise's tomato plants in the second summer produced more than she had dared hope. The extended beds were heavy with fruit from late July through September, and she processed enough to fill the root cellar and trade at the general store and give a quantity to Harriet Blaine, who said she had never tasted better, and said it in the particularly sincere tone that Harriet used when she was being honest rather than social. At the end of the harvest season, Louise counted her seeds. She had 231 tomato seeds in the cedar box, which was full now and required a rubber band around it to keep the lid on. She sat at the kitchen table with James in the crook of one arm, asleep against her chest, and counted them on the table with her free hand while the evening light came through the windows. And when she reached 231, she sat back and thought about the 23 seeds she had arrived with in the spring of 1878, and the $38 and the cast iron skillet. Matthew came in from the yard and saw her at the table and came over and looked at the seeds on the table and then at her face. "How many?" he asked. 231, she said. He sat down across from her and looked at the seeds for a moment and then at her, and then at James asleep against her chest, and then he put his elbows on the table and his chin in his hands and smiled at her with the full, easy, unguarded smile that she had been collecting since July of the previous year. "Not bad," he said, "for a woman with a skillet." She laughed, and James stirred at the sound of it, and she settled him with a gentle hand and kept laughing. The sod house addition was completed in October of 1879, and in November a family came, just as Matthew had imagined they would, just as Louise had come off the stage from the east with a wagon loaded with their belongings and a homestead claim in hand and nowhere to stay while they found their footing. Their name was Holt. Thomas and Mary Holt, both in their late 20s, with a daughter of 3 named Esther and Mary in the early months of expecting their second. They were from Ohio, and they had that look that Louise recognized immediately, the look of people who have decided to be brave and are not entirely sure yet whether brave was right. Matthew offered them the sod house. Louise offered them the use of the kitchen garden and the root cellar's surplus, and the cast iron skillet, which she insisted upon lending though she expected it back, and Mary Holt took it in her hands as if she understood the weight of it in the right way. Thomas Holt worked the Kendrick ranch through the winter in exchange for lodging and supplies, which was the arrangement that made sense for both parties, and by the following spring, the Holts were established enough to begin truly working their own claim, and the sod house gave them the time to do it. Louise sat on the porch of the ranch house one evening in late October, while Matthew was out checking the south fence and James was asleep inside, and she watched the Holt lantern glow warm in the sod house window 2 miles across the dark prairie, and she thought about lanterns and windows, and the way that help given forward multiplies like seeds. She thought about March of 1878, and the stage and the dust storm and the man in the land office with ink on his fingers, and the way Matthew Kendrick had leaned on his fence post with his pale gray eyes and told her the well had gone dry, offered her shelter and seeds and scents, and lost something he had not known he was protecting. She put her hand on her abdomen, because she had been aware for 2 weeks of something new beginning, quiet and certain as a seed in the dark, and she had not told Matthew yet because she was waiting for the right moment, and this was the right moment. She heard his horse in the yard and the sound of him unsaddling, the familiar pattern of it that she could follow by ear now without needing to see it, and then his boots on the porch steps and the creak of the boards, and he came and leaned against the porch post beside her chair and looked out at the same dark prairie and the same warm light in the sod house window. "The Holts are settled in," he said. "I can see the light," she said. They were quiet together for a moment, the good quiet of people who have earned it. "Matthew," she said, "yes. James is going to have a brother or sister." He was still for a moment, and then he turned and looked at her in the dark, and she could see the shape of his smile even without full light. He pushed off the post and came and crouched beside her chair, taking her hands in both of his. "Summer?" he asked. "I think late spring," she said. "May, maybe June." He brought her hands up and pressed his lips to her knuckles and held them there. "Good," he said, the word muffled against her hands. "Good." She pulled his hands against her chest and leaned down and pressed her forehead against his hair, and they held that way in the October dark with the prairie enormous around them, and the lantern light warm in the distance, and the whole turned, excellent world resting easy. The second child came on the 28th of May, 1880. A boy again, Robert Matthew Kendrick, named by Matthew this time, who suggested the first name, and Louise confirmed it as right, and both of them agreed that Matthew was the only thing to call the second name. Robert was a bigger baby than James had been, with Louise's brown eyes, and according to Doc Mercer, her expression, which he said with a laugh and which proved accurate as soon as Robert was old enough to begin expressing opinions about things, which was early. James, who was almost exactly 11 months old when Robert arrived, regarded his brother with the grave and somewhat baffled expression of someone who has just discovered that the world contains complications they had not been prepared for. Pete Calloway said it was the funniest face he had ever seen on a human being. Silvio said James would get used to it. Dwight said nothing, but picked both babies up at the same time one afternoon and held one in each arm, and the expression on his weathered face was something that nobody who was present would ever forget. The ranch was full. The house was full. The land was full of growing things. Louise planted her tomatoes every spring from that point forward, and every year the seeds multiplied, and every year she gave the surplus seeds away, to new homesteaders, to the Holt family, to the church for the community garden that Harriet Blaine organized, to anyone who needed a start and had the will to give something a chance in the ground. She kept the cedar box. It stayed on the shelf above the bed in the ranch house, moved there from the sod house, and even as it filled and emptied and filled again over the years, it stayed on that shelf where she could see it every morning when she opened her eyes, because it was the first thing she had been given in Kansas, and it meant what things mean when they have been made with care. Matthew's hair went gray at the temples by 1882, which Louise thought suited him considerably, and said so plainly, which made him look at her with the slightly surprised expression he wore when she said things that pleased him more than he was prepared for. He had stopped being careful about being pleased. He had stopped a long time ago. In the summer of 1882, James Kendrick, aged 3, who had developed a personality that was an exact and sometimes alarming combination of his mother's directness and his father's steadiness, walked out to the tomato bed in the south garden at the ranch. Louise had started a second tomato bed at the ranch house itself, closer to the kitchen, and crouched down beside the plants with his small brow furrowed in concentrated study. Matthew was watching from the porch, and he called Louise out to see. They stood together on the porch and watched their son squat in the garden, examining the plants with total seriousness. "He wants to know how they work," Louise said. "He does," Matthew agreed. James picked a small green tomato and regarded it. Then he looked up and found his parents watching him and held it out in his hand with the particular expression of a child presenting evidence. "Not ready yet, bud," Matthew called. James looked at the tomato. Then he put it carefully back on the plant, which was a remarkable exercise in either restraint or logic for a 3-year-old. "He did that right," Louise said. "He did," Matthew said, and his hand found hers and held it easy and certain on the porch rail. They stood and watched James wander further into the garden, investigating each row with focused attention, Robert toddling behind him and falling down twice, and getting up each time without particularly minding. The Kansas sky above them was the October blue, that specific definitive blue that comes when the season is making its final argument. The fields around the ranch were the gold of late harvest. The horses moved in the corral. The whole working, growing, breathing world went on around them. Louise Doyle, Louise Kendrick, though she kept both names in her own thinking, because both were true, stood on her husband's porch with her hand in his, and thought about 23 seeds and a dead man's chair, and a dust storm in March, and a man leaning on a fence post with pale gray eyes who had offered her shelter and sense, and the location of the water. She thought about what you can grow from almost nothing when the ground is right and the care is real. She thought that the ground had turned out to be very right, and the care had turned out to be the realest thing she had ever known. Matthew turned and looked at her, the way he did sometimes when the afternoon went quiet, with full and open attention, not examining but simply seeing her, the way a man looks at something he loves without needing to justify the looking. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Seeds," she said. He smiled, the real one, the full one that she had been collecting since that long-ago July picnic with the lemonade and the sunburned drover and the first honest moment between them. "We have plenty," he said. "We do," she agreed, and tightened her hand in his and looked out at the wide, golden, impossible world they had built together from the ground up. "We absolutely do."